Brian Lehrer on WNYC. So we're about 2 weeks on now from that winter storm that dumped around a foot of snow across our area and blanketed streets, sidewalks, and public and private spaces alike. And we're well into a cold snap that has turned much of that snow to ice. The agency charged with clearing all of it in New York City, as if I had to tell you, and that means thousands of miles across New York City streets, right, is the Department of Sanitation. And that's on top of its day-to-day responsibility of collecting trash, recycling, and composting, and more routine cleaning of the streets. And let's just say not everyone is happy about how they've managed to keep up. And now comes the inevitable melting with its own problems to boot. With us now is Javier Lojan, the acting commissioner of the New York City Sanitation Department. Commissioner Lojan has been leading DSNY since late 2024. Commissioner, thanks for coming on. Welcome to WNYC.
Good morning. Thank you for having me today.
And listeners, our lines are open. What do you want to ask or say to the Sanitation Commissioner? 212-433-WNYC. Complaints are okay. Compliments are okay. An observation about what the city needs still after this storm or anything else going forward? 212-433-WNYC, or help us still report the story of the post-storm period and tell us how things are on your block. I know one person who lives in Queens and has a garage with a driveway says the plows keep coming through and snowing her in because the snow from the street gets plowed to block her driveway, and then she has to shovel again. So whatever your story is, 212-433-9692. So, Commissioner, take us through some of this. How many miles of streets is DSNY responsible for clearing after a storm like this? And what does the operation look like, especially in the first 24 to 48 hours?
Sure. So we're responsible to clear a little over 6,400 miles of roadway. When you look at it lane miles, because, each roadway might have multiple lanes, about 19,000 lane miles. So it's quite the massive undertaking. And, in parallel to that, we're also clearing, close to 250 miles of protected bike lane infrastructure across the city. So, going into a storm, the biggest thing is, making sure we have all our adequate resources ready to go. Depending on the forecast. A storm, of the magnitude that we had, at the end of January was a 12 to 15 inch storm, which, a lot of times forecasts can be a little tricky, but, in that case, it was pretty spot on. So we pretty much go into full snow mode. We plow up all our trucks. We load up all our salt spreaders. We have over 700 salt spreaders, 2,200 plows. And, the plows, I want to remind everybody, which I'm sure a lot of the listeners may know, is that they're your traditional garbage trucks that you're used to seeing, going week to week, picking up your refuse and recyclables. So we convert those into plows. And then, we work with some of our agency partners as well, who supplement some of our work. Department of Transportation, Department of Parks, Department of Environmental Protection. And it's a really coordinated effort. Obviously the mayor's office is very engaged and, NYSM as well. So it's all hands on deck for this kind of storm. And then, we split our workforce into 12-hour shifts. So, we have a morning shift and that runs into the afternoon. And then we have a night shift that comes in right after that. And we continue that throughout, depending on the storm. We'll start salting and then plowing. And then that's pretty much how we, the first 24 hours go. We track everything, through our internal tool, which we call Blade Runner, and we have our snow command center here at headquarters, and we track, our assets across the city and ensure that everybody's getting the service that they should be receiving. And then, we're tracking that depending on the snowfall, the rates of snowfall and, the timing and everything. Then we're making some operational adjustments. But at a high level, that's basically how the first 24 hours go.
And because this storm was hours of snow followed by hours of sleet, and then the deep freeze kind of locking that ice into place, how harder did this become than whatever snowfalls in the past you want to compare it to?
Yeah, so I mean, I've been on, been fortunate enough to be with this agency for 27 years. So I've seen a lot of snowstorms. I want to say this is in the top five, and obviously, the amount of snow that fell wouldn't fall into that category, but the cold weather that followed was just something intense that I don't see much of. You look back at a storm, the Boxing Day blizzard of 2010. The city got buried. There was a lot of issues with that storm. Jonas in 2016, those were two big noticeable storms that, while they were a lot higher in the snowfall amounts, I think the temperatures were not anything close to compared to what we got in this storm. I think on average, the temperatures after those storms were, above 30 degrees. Where here, we were teetering on, we're lucky if we saw 20 degrees during the day. And at night, that just froze even more and more, made everything like rock. So definitely one of the most challenging storms we've had to face as far as, post-storm, because I think during the first 24 hours of the storm, I think the agency did a great job, clearing all the roads and the bike lanes, as I mentioned. One of the things to also take into account for the listeners is that, typical rock salt starts losing effectiveness when you start going below 20 degrees, even greater below 15 degrees. This storm, the first day, we were at 12, 13 degrees. So we supplement that with calcium chloride, which, lowers the effectiveness. But it's just one of these storms that was very, very challenging because of the cold temperatures.
And I think I'm channeling most, if not all, of our New York City listeners by giving props, to all the sanitation workers who have worked so incredibly hard over the last few weeks. Someone told me yesterday that they saw a half dozen sanitation workers hacking away at a single frozen mound with shovels the other day. So what tools do you have for the kind of ice still in small hills on New York City streets right now?
Right. So we have a multi-pronged approach when it comes to, snow removal, particularly around pedestrian infrastructure. So, we have, as you mentioned, ice choppers and shovels. And typically that would be sufficient enough, obviously depending on the temperatures. We also have mechanized equipment, which in this storm, we leveraged a lot more. So we have what we call smaller skid steers. And those are very nimble pieces of equipment. They're smaller. We have front end loaders that are, usually they're, people would know them as payloaders, but they're, like the smaller sizes we have, and we use those to clear out some of those areas. And then, we hire emergency snow shovelers. So we have people that, are willing to come in and brave the cold and do some manual labor for a little extra money. And, we've employed hundreds of them. So, a multi-pronged approach, as I mentioned. And I think in this storm, we even we expanded the reach, and we hired, emergency contracts, contractors that have this kind of equipment that they use, throughout the year for, landscapers, construction companies that have this kind of equipment. And we expanded our reach. So we had every resources out there available to get at and clear out a lot of these areas.
I'm going to take a phone call for you from Louise in Brooklyn, who's going to articulate probably the most common complaint that we've gotten from listeners over these couple of weeks. Louise, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hi, Brian. Good morning. Good morning, Commissioner. Thank you for taking my call. Yes, I want to repeat that we do appreciate that the streets were cleared and we were able to move our cars if we could get these spaces around us cleared, which is certainly not the responsibility of the sanitation. But the biggest complaint is that we get our pickup of garbage on Saturdays and Wednesdays. And the Saturday before the storm, we did not get a garbage pickup. So there were 6 pickups missed during the course of this weather event. And the first time we got a pickup was last week. I think it was either Thursday or Friday. We finally got a pickup. And the garbage was horrendous in the neighborhood. I'm in Midwood. Or the other complaint was that crosswalks and bus stops were not cleared. So, of course, that added to the danger of people, pedestrians and drivers alike. But I appreciate that I could, voice this. I'm sure you've heard these complaints before, but thank you that you took my call. Thank you.
No, and Lisa, I'm very sorry to hear that, you were missed. As far as our operation goes, the Saturday before the storm, we had reported that everything was completed. Obviously, look, there might have been a missed collection unintentionally, obviously. So I apologize, from the top down. That should not be the case. And, going into the storm, obviously that's a separate challenge that I'll get into a little bit. But, obviously, during the storm and after post-storm, we don't accept 311 complaints for miscollections because we're in, parallel efforts there. But, if you got missed the Saturday, you're able to call 311. We have reactivated the 311 complaints for miscollections as of yesterday. So obviously, if that becomes a challenge, going forward, please, I encourage you to call 311. But it's one of those things that we are looking at. Nobody should have to experience that. And again, I apologize, and that's something that we know we have to get better at. And as far as the crosswalks and the bus stops, that is one of the things that we did, recognize that was a challenge, for the city. And I just want to paint the picture here that, we normally go into these operations after we clear the streets and the bike lanes. I think one of the things that made it so challenging is that a typical crosswalk may take our workers who are shoveling this manually during a storm of this magnitude, anywhere from, 5 to 15 minutes, right? You're clearing a path wide enough, on both curb cuts, and then you move on to another one, right? This one, we had some reports of some of our workers having to take close to an hour in each one. And that's why when we supplemented with our mechanized equipment, that was we focused on that more, because the manual labor, which is very time consuming, it just slowed us down a little more. So again, it's one of those things that we're looking at to get better at, maybe be more efficient on how we kind of throw different things at it, depending on the severity of the storm. But it is one of those things that we are closely evaluating, not only with internally as the DSNY is concerned, but other agencies. We have agency partners that were great and helped us out with giving us supplemental work, and they were aiding these efforts. So I think just with them looking at that holistically and saying, how can we do this better from the onset, is obviously one of the things that we want to make sure we get out of this post-storm, review as far as DSNY is concerned.
Well, once the snow and ice came, did trash collection have to fall behind as much as it did?
Yeah, so one of the things to keep in mind is that the same workers, and I mentioned the trucks that are plowing the streets and, clearing some of these areas, are the same ones that are collecting the trash. So a few days after the storm, we did initiate collections on, Tuesday frequency and going forward. One of the, we had to prioritize, so there's, a few material streams. So you have, the refuse, the compost, and then you have your recyclables, which are, metal, glass, plastics, and paper. Because we had to make sure we still prioritize some of these areas of snow removal, as you mentioned, the crosswalks and the bus stops and other areas that we had to continue to readdress. We had to prioritize the refuse and the compost collections for the first week of the storm. And we knew we were intentionally backlogging ourselves on recyclables. What we did find after the storm is that, when we went through some of these frequency areas, some people didn't put out. So then the following week, when then we resumed full collection operations, it was double of everything. So the other thing I will also want to remind the listeners are, typically during a normal day of DSNY operations, the way our workforce is structured is you have the day begins at midnight for the majority of the workforce. So you have a midnight shift. They work till 8 a.m, and then you have a day shift, which usually starts about 6 o'clock in the morning. The bulk of our collections are done on the midnight and then the 6 a.m. shift. So, we have done that to ensure that, people get service early, and you don't have bags of trash on the street in the afternoon. So, people are used to not seeing a lot of that material, day to day in the morning. Maybe, by the time they get to work, it's already gone, right? Mm-hmm. Because we had to split our operation, so we had everybody on mandatory 12-hour shift operations. We had a 6 a.m. shift, and then we had a 6 p.m. shift. So now what that meant was we couldn't go after the entire material stream across the city on one shift. We had to split it up. So a lot of people were getting picked up at 6 a.m. and then a lot of them were being picked up at 6 p.m. And that went into the overnight. And because we were backlogged, some of that material went into the following morning. So obviously, the focus was on the trash collection, so it just got intensified even more. But I think just the way our staffing had to be structured because of the split shift operation, a lot of people saw that material out more and more throughout the day rather than a typical day, which starts at midnight and I mentioned, goes into the early afternoon, not into the evening.
So many people are calling and texting with questions. So let's go to Barbara on Staten Island next. Barbara, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Oh, hello, and thank you. Commissioner, I went online and looked, and the concept is out there about these hot tub trucks. I'm wondering, in combination with salt, I know that has to be used, but if I'm bringing it up because I'm on a side street, and I did shovel and had myself dug out. But the other side of the street, because of the plow always goes to that side, they cannot really shovel very easily because the salted ice has turned brick hard, and I'm sure. Right. So I'm wondering if in the mix, if this steam trucks or steam idea can be used a little more liberally to open up, because even though I can get out, I know if I pull out, I will not have a spot when I come back.
Right.
And then what will I do?
Right.
Commissioner.
So just I think one of the things where snow melters is what we call, which you're referring to the hot tubs. We have 13 of those across the city. There's actually 3 in Staten Island. The way those work, just to clarify for everybody, it's not, those melters are not melting the snow at that location where they're being used. The way the operation works, and you may have seen this across the city, is we have a lot of this mechanized equipment that will go out and clear streets across different parts of the city. They will create, these small mounds of snow, and then we'll put them in these dump trucks. The dump trucks then go to the snow melter site, and then they create humongous piles and dump them there. And then our payloaders or front-end loaders will then take those mounds and dump them into the snow melter, and that's how we melt it. It's not at the location of where those melters are. We're creating piles. We're clearing out as much as we can from, various parts of the city, and then we're bringing them to these locations to melt it there. So that's just one of the things to clarify for the listeners about the snow melters. And again, we have 13 across the city, so that is something that we are finding effective. I think we're close to almost 200,000 tons of snow melted to date, and we're going to probably exceed that because that effort's continuing on.
Interesting. We talked about clearing the streets and the corners and the bus stops. Here's a question from a listener who writes, who's in charge of clearing sidewalks around and in playgrounds and basketball court surfaces inside of New York City parks? Listener writes, none have been cleared. Our middle school uses a New York City park for recess and have not been able to go outdoors for play for weeks. And somebody else writes a related question who has that question for schoolyards themselves. So what's the answer to the parks and the schoolyards?
So each agency partner is responsible for their property and surrounding area. So in the case of the Parks Department would be responsible for that. And then as far as the schoolyard, the Department of Education would be responsible for the removal of the snow on those properties.
Sharon in Manhattan, you're on WNYC with the Sanitation Commissioner, Javier Lojan. Sharon, hi.
Hi. Thank you very much for taking the call. This is a question about a rule that I heard, that residential buildings, everybody's responsible for shoveling the snow from the sidewalks, but they're not supposed to put it into the street. And it's really a very difficult thing to walk down I've seen lots of people who cannot get out anywhere. And if you have to take a car like Access-a-Ride or something where you have to have transportation where you can't get on a public bus or something like that, it's virtually impossible to get out to the street. So what is that rule about not being able to put the snow in the street so you can't really shovel paths to get out to the street? And it seems like an almost impossible rule.
Sounds like a catch-22. You got to clear the sidewalk in front of your building or house, but you're not supposed to put it in the street. Where is it supposed to go, Commissioner?
Right. So I understand the challenge there. The reason why the rule is in place about not throwing in the street is a lot of times when we clear the roadways during a storm and immediately after a storm, we get people clearing out, their sidewalks and things like that, and they will put that back into the street. That becomes a hazard for a lot of motorists because it's still cold. The roadway seems like it's not untreated. So we put that rule in place so people aren't just throwing the snow back into the street, and then it just requires us to go back and replow it. That understanding is a challenge. Each borough and each location is unique, and obviously understanding that real estate is not always easy to find in certain areas. It's one of those things where we just try to ask people to try to, figure out what works best for their property. And if it means, making small piles and having a small opening, that might be a solution. But yeah, that rule is in place. So people aren't just throwing snow back in the street and then recreating hazards for the roadway.
And here's maybe a related question. I mentioned this in the intro with someone I know in Queens. Looks like Margarita in the Bronx has the same issue. Margarita, hello.
Yes, good morning. Good morning, Commissioner, and thanks for taking my call. And believe me, I was a city employee for a lot of years, so I know it's rough to satisfy everybody, the public, the higher echelon, the whole 9 yards. However, I live on a residential street, and all the neighbors came out. We all helped each other get our cars out of our driveways, and there was a sanitation worker. He was so nice, explaining everything to us. My question to him was, and to you also, doesn't sanitation have an app to tell the drivers that one street has been cleaned already so they don't have to come and redo it? He said, the worker said to me, well, my shift's not going to come back, but the next shift is. And I said, you can't communicate to the next shift saying, blah, blah, blah street has been done already, so skip that, go to the next street.
Yeah. But is part of your question that when the plows come through again, they plow you in, meaning your driveway?
My driveway, and I'm chopping ice again. Three times in a row I went out there. And I have, that thing everybody else has. I have a herniated disc, yada, yada. But like I said, the day and age of there's an app for every damn thing. You mean to tell me there's not an app for sanitation people to say what blocks have been cleared and what blocks still need attention?
Margarita, thank you. Commissioner?
Margarita, first, thank you for that. I appreciate, the statement of support there for city employees. So as far as an app, so we actually have, and it's one of these things that, obviously we got, depending on the block, we could look into that. We actually have navigation devices in all of our trucks. So we have route-specific software in each truck, which it's pretty sophisticated, where an operator is assigned a specific route at the beginning of his or her tour. They get in that route. That navigation device will give them turn-by-turn directions to the route, and then when they're on the route, going on to the next segment. And as they're completing the route, or if they don't complete the route and then it has to be finished off on the subsequent shift, we have the ability to continue that route exactly where it left off. So we don't have the issues, as you mentioned, where, operators are informing each other of where they left off and what has to be done, because obviously that's not, an efficient way to operate. So we have all of our trucks have navigation devices. It's a pretty sophisticated system. And if they somehow have to deviate off the route, we have a return to route feature that will bring them back. Whether it's for an obstruction, there could be like a fuel truck on the block, a disabled vehicle, whatever it may be, and then they can come back and make sure that block's not missed. So again, it could, I look at that specific scenario, and then as far as plowing back, the driveways, that is one of the things that we are always stressing to our operators. During a snowstorm, it's a little difficult because they have to plow, as they're going everywhere. But post-storm, that is one of the things that we are, instilling in our operators, that they have to be very mindful of, not plowing anybody back in, because that is frustrating. And I understand, why you would feel that way.
Before you go, where does personal or community responsibility come in? Someone in Manhattan sent me some images of a scene in Riverside Park after people had gone sledding with lots of cardboard, makeshift sleds and stuff. And those and other litter were just left behind. It actually reminded me of the images we've seen recently of litter piling up in Yosemite National Park after President Trump defunded a lot of national park staffing. So in that case, the staffing was a problem, but also people going to Yosemite are leaving behind that much litter. So in this case, in Riverside Park, so I imagine it's happening elsewhere in the city too. Have your sanitation workers been encountering scenes like that, or do you have any message or request for the general public in situations like this post-snow period?
Yeah, and we have encountered different, obviously, unfortunately, people do litter and, sometimes are not considerate. So we have encountered that. We have been able to, the last week, shift back into making sure that those areas are addressed. Inside a park would be the responsibility of the Parks Department. Obviously 311 is one of the best tools that, I suggest everybody use, because that's where exactly we would be going to and sending our resources to. As far as a message for the public, I think, using, our litter baskets, that's the best resources available, because those will continue to service around the clock. And try to be mindful of where you put your waste. Unfortunately, a lot of these conditions could be avoided, if people actually dispose of their waste, appropriately. But, obviously we understand it's a city of 8.5 million people, and, not everybody gets the same message, but, we'll continue to try to refine our operation as much as we can and, provide everybody the level of service that they deserve.
Let me throw one other thing in, then we're out of time. The old quote, maybe you know it better than I do. I'm going to paraphrase it. I think it's Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia from like 100 years ago, saying there's no Democratic or Republican way to pick up the garbage. Now that you've served under Mayor Adams and a little bit under Mayor Mamdani, is there a centrist and a DSA way to pick up the garbage?
No, it's all the same. I think that's one of the things that I've personally enjoyed working for this agency for, as I mentioned, over 27 years now, is that regardless of who's been in office, when it comes to snow removal and waste removal, it's just the goal and the objective is to provide everybody the level of service that they deserve, regardless of, political affiliations or anything. So that's always one of the things that I've enjoyed the most. And, I think, it'll continue on that way.
Do you want Mayor Mamdani to keep you on?
I think right now I'm focused on, making sure everybody gets the level of service they deserve and, obviously rectifying any of the issues and the after action and seeing where we could do better. And, one day at a time. That's the way I've taken every day. So I'll just continue to do that.
Good attitude toward life, not just work, right? Javier Lojan, the acting commissioner of the New York City Sanitation Department. Thank you so much for giving us this time today and engaging with so many listeners. We all really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to be on.